Welcome everybody. This is a video I've been meaning to make for quite a while, but in response to a thread that's been going on around Reddit, I figured it is finally time to do this because every period of time, be it a year, 6 months, whatever, somebody starts screaming that there's hacking going on. And on Reddit, I have taken a very hard stance that there's absolutely not something going on. And I wanted to back up what I was saying and then point out some interesting observations because we're at a stage now where it's actually becoming a little bit almost irrefutable what we're seeing in results. So let's delve into the topic of the game, how it plays out, security and hacking and possible attacks on this and what's viable and what's not. So before we get into this, let me start off by stating that while I am not an expert on the subject of security and hacking, I have spent some time working within the security space. So I do know enough to be dangerous. There are only some of these things that I could actually do myself, but actually doing some of these things myself is not necessarily within my capabilities, but I do know what I'm talking about. So going into this whole thing, there's some stipulations that I am assuming about this that, if proven to be false, will break down a lot of what I'm saying. But first of all, I am assuming Com2 is not stupid. They've produced a good game. I'm assuming they know how to architect things fairly well, that they are architecting around standard patterns that are used for scalable applications and distributed applications, such as this, distributed meaning there's a phone app that interacts with servers, that their servers are deployed on a server farm, and that server farm has innate and basic protections built into it, as is typical with any type of cloud-based computing, Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, whatever. And that finally, and this is a big one, standard encryption or message protection is being used. And we'll get into a little bit about what that means a little bit later. So let's move on from here. First, before we get into architecture and attack vectors and these types of things, there's some things we need to accept and understand about the game that impact its ability to be hacked or manipulated. First, when you have a game that has interactive modes such as clutch, play, arcade, these types of things, that involves the phone. That you're interacting with the phone and you're causing some types of effects that the phone has to record and has to communicate back to the server. Those are imminently more hackable than other areas of the game. When you have non-interactive modes, such as ranked play, staged games, and friendly, in which you fire and forget, and you have no ability to perform subs in the middle of the game, you have no ability to do manual like at-bats, any of these types of things, you have no agency over the course of the game. Those are non-interactive modes, and those are a different level of how difficult it would be to actually hack those. So you might have heard me say statements that ranked play, there's no way that it's being hacked, it's virtually impossible. Let's get into why that is. So in summary, more interactivity, the greater the chances are that something is going to be hacked or that it could be hacked. So the next important thing to understand is how games are processed and how the results are generated by Com2 and the servers and then recorded. And that is the game outcomes are actually predictable, not by us, but by Com2. Based on knowing their own formulas, they're going to operate largely like a spreadsheet. So if you can imagine this small example that I put there on the right, if you know what the spreadsheet calculations are going to do, you can always predict the output. So in this case, with a 5, I always know it's going to come out to 305. If I put in a 10, I always know it's going to come out to 310, right? Because we know the formulas. And I can take that formula and I can give it to somebody else and give them a 5, and I know that they're going to come out with 305. This is very much the same as it is with this game. The only difference being with this game, the input value is a random number. And from that random number, from the random number generator, RNG, Everything else is determined. Okay, so what that enables COM2 to do is have one value that they can build, a random number. They can feed it into the game engine and they can come up with a consistent result every time. They can feed that same random number to you and you can generate the same results using the same formulas and find the exact same outcome that they did from their calculations. So what proof do we have of this? How do we know this is actually happening? First of all, if you've initiated a ranked play game and your phone has aborted for some reason or you've shut it down or whatever, at that stage the random number has been generated or the seed has been generated and it's already been fed to your phone. So when you power back up your phone's going to know, oh, I had a game in process. And as many times as you try and shut that down, the outcome will always be the same because the random number is always the same, and therefore the outcome is always the same. And COM2 already knows this. They've already saved it on their servers. When you fire that phone back up, they're not feeding you the results back down. In worst case scenario where you've lost that, they'll resend you the random number and your phone will regenerate the results. How else do we know this? We know that if you were to imagine a game running and all the processing and all the calculations of the batting outcomes and this type of stuff, if it attempted to communicate back and forth between the server and the game, all that was going on, the amount of network traffic for one game would be immense. And now multiply that by thousands of users at the same time, the result simply would not scale. The game would not perform, the game outcomes would take forever, and everybody would complain and nobody would play the game. So it doesn't scale, it's not performant, it's just not an architecture that is sustainable. Therefore, they have to go with some type of mechanism, such as generating a key or seed value and feeding it down to you. So this is important to understand to move on from this in the discussion. So the RNG, or random number generator, is a very important point in this whole thing, and it leads to possible vulnerabilities in hacking or attempting hacking of this app or program. Okay, the first thing you need to understand, because I'm sure you've heard this knee-jerk response, it's all random. It's just RNG. But the reality is RNG is not truly random in most cases. Okay, your standard programming libraries, be those C# or whatever Apple's equivalent or whatever those are, they will have a function that generates a random number. It uses an algorithm or a formula, and it produces a series of, quote, random numbers. In order to do this, what it needs is a seed value. And it's very similar to that whole spreadsheet thing. If you feed in a known number, and you feed it through a random number generator, if you feed in the same number, you will always get the exact same series of, quote, random numbers from that. Okay, so this also translates into if you have and can provide a given set of seeds, and you can track those, and you can track the outcomes, eventually you can reverse engineer what the algorithm or formula is for generating the random numbers. And this is a vulnerability. Now, this is also why, if you are to talk about in the security space and they ever encounter a need for a random number generator, one of the things that they will require is that you use a, quote, cryptographically secure RNG, which means it's a lot more involved. The process of actually generating the random number is a lot more involved, and it cannot be derived. Now, games out there and standard applications, nobody outside of the security space is going to use cryptographically secure random number generators. It's just overkill. There's overhead with it. It's simply not going to be done. Therefore, if COM2 is not using one of these, that means somebody could theoretically reverse engineer the random numbers. And therein lies a possible avenue for attacking this whole thing. So one quick thing before we jump into this on this topic of the random numbers, the most common seed that is used, or something that is used to generate the seed, is going to be a timestamp down to the microseconds. Uh, so typically, in order to first initiate your random numbered series, somebody's going to feed in something that is a timestamp or derived from a timestamp, and that once again will factor in when we take a look at something just a little bit later on here. But what I've done here is I've mapped out this really high level, and you could nitpick this apart if you wanted to, but it kind of gives you the general idea of what we're doing, and I'm abstracting a lot of stuff. But you have your phone, that's the game, the app's on there, and it's going to be communicating to COM2 over the internet, over the network, and there's a lot of other stuff in between there, but all we care about is that there are messages going across. It's eventually going to arrive at a data center containing the servers that are going to be handling this all. And then I've mapped out what I think are probably some likely parts of the whole thing. There's going to be services or microservices, a bunch of stuff working in conjunction with each other. It's not going to be a app per se like you're used to on a phone. It's a singular thing. When you're talking about applications like this and games like this, it's a series or a bunch of collection of various services all doing different things to support the whole game behavior. So let's take a look at what a typical interaction with this might look like. So let's take a look at what engaging ranked play might look like in a series of steps. First of all, on the left-hand side, you would initiate a game from your phone or series of games from your phone, and that would essentially cause the phone to reach out to the server and say, hey, player wants to start a new game. So number two, the phone notifies the server. And on here, something I didn't cover in the last one, those little lines with the round circles at the end or round dots at the end, that's an endpoint. And what that means is if you can imagine there's a firewall where all the traffic going in there is ignored, but there's holes in the firewall that the application does listen through, that's what an endpoint is. So the phone's going to be talking to an endpoint on the server, and all other types of requests are going to be ignored. But anyways, the phone notifies the server. The server says, okay, you want to initiate a game? Let me find you an opponent. Okay, now let me generate a random number seed for you, and here it is, and here's your opponent, so you can go and replay that for the player while I concurrently sit over here and I'm going to generate the game results such that I can take all the stats and record them into the database so that when you go and see how your team's performing, you can get it from a central source and you don't have the opportunity to manipulate it. And this is key. Nothing you do on the phone is going to change the behavior of what the game is generating. You can do that to your heart's content. You can hack the results on your phone for all you want. You can try and tell the server, but the server's not going to listen to you of what the result is. The server's already generated a result and stored it in the database. Okay, so that takes us through number 4, and then finally, in number 5, we fed back this seed. The player gets the seed, runs it through the game client, and you get to watch the outcome, and you see the ending stats being the same as what the server generated. And that whole process is very key to securing this whole thing because the endpoints prevent people from interacting with the server in ways other than what it wants to be interacted with. And on top of that, everything's hidden behind a firewall, so all the code is essentially secure. And at the same time, it does not require the phone to actually do anything for the results to be generated, saved, and be secured. So let's take a look at, of this whole thing, what are different ways that you could go about trying to hack this or attack this? Now that we have an idea of what should be happening with the game and the servers, let's take a look at possible routes somebody could use to attack this whole thing or hack it per se. And this is not an exhaustive list, but for this particular application, this would be the most common attack vectors that you would see. So first thing to note, revisiting the last slide, how I called out that the firewall and the data center has only a very certain ways that you can interact with it. And therefore, something deployed on Google Cloud would have all of the built-in protections that a cloud data center would offer it. So that would be your firewalls, potentially demilitarized zones. There's going to be protection against distributed denial of service attacks, etc., etc. So this also means through a proper architecture, and once again, we're assuming COM2 is using a reasonable architecture, the database will not be exposed directly to the internet, which means in order to get to the database to manipulate results or do anything like that, you'd have to breach the data center first and then affect the database. So that's not a small task. We'll talk about that in the next slide. And then finally, by being behind the firewall and having all the server code on the data center, it's going to behave largely like a black box. A black box meaning you can only interact with it in a certain way, very similar to the whole spreadsheet analogy. You feed it a number, it feeds you something back. In this case, you feed it a game request, it gives you back something that's going to let you find out what the results of that are. Or if you're browsing your team, you want to see your stats, you're going to tell it, I want stats, and it's going to return you stats for your team up to that minute for ranked play. So all behind the firewall, all within a black box per se. Now, we'll walk through each of these spoofing app hacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, and data center breach in the next slides. So I am going to work in reverse order from the most complicated and difficult attacks down to the easiest. And the data center breach is going to be the hardest of the attacks, because in order to breach a data center, you're going to need to have some type of level of privileges and access to the systems inside. And in order to gain that, one of two things has to happen. Either somebody has to be negligent and make the credentials and access available, which has been known to happen in servers under desktop, somebody using a stupid password, that type of thing. But those days are gone. Okay, when you're talking about something that's deployed onto AWS or that type of thing, if you're at that level, nobody's going to be using password as their password. The login actual username isn't going to be admin. These types of things are not going to be easily attainable. So therefore, to gain something like that, you're going to have to do a very engaged attack. And when I said on Reddit state level attackers, this means state sponsored stuff like Chinese hackers or Russian hackers, people who are actually, their whole job is to hack into systems. And what they'll do is, the current approach is to use social engineering, which is where you get somebody to do a phishing attack against you, or somebody approaches you on Facebook, they get you to help them reset their password, those types of things. Those are all social attacks. And from there, as long as they can gain to one thing, access to one thing, then they'll use that to, as they say, pivot to something else. Okay, well, I have this. Now I have some information about you. I can use that to attempt to discern your other account information. You're probably using the same username. So I'll go attack a bunch of different sites, and I'll use the same username. And I will try your password to see if it overlaps with any of those sites. And once there, then we'll say, okay, I can see now what your home address is. I can see now this is your contact phone number. So then I can try and get your two-factor authentication to go to my phone number instead, because you haven't set it up on this one site. And as you can see, and from there, it's a whole process of pivoting between things, gaining more and more access, and eventually getting to the point where you could even get into the data center. Okay, so you can see that's no small process. Now, let's say you actually managed to pull that off, and now you're on the data center. Now you're faced with, first of all, you could be faced with being in a demilitarized zone, which means you are on a separate physical network from everything else. So now you have to repeat the whole process and figure out, how am I going to jump networks and get onto the other one? And then what are the credentials for me to gain access to the other network? But I don't think COM2 has gone that far. I doubt they have a demilitarized zone. So they probably just have their stuff on the web behind a firewall, and they have various apps running. So now you're going to have to be able to interfere with those apps. So what are you going to do? First of all, you'd have to potentially hack the code while on there, which would take a long time to figure out what they're doing, reverse engineer the code, etc., all while being undetected, and then eventually figure out how to manipulate things. Or let's say you instead want to get to the database. Well, that's going to have a different set of credentials, and so now you have to figure out how to get actually to the data. And then there's going to be stuff supporting the integrity of the data, potentially, or and I doubt they're going to do this too, but the data could be encrypted. So how are you going to get to the encrypted data? You can't just see the stat, and I want to change that to 50 home runs on this player instead, right? That's not going to happen. Not to mention, the database is going to hold the results of the games that are different from what token you were fed to generate your game, and the game has already been generated. So you'd have to not only hack the game results, you'd have to hack all the stats that are affected by it, and that's going to trickle down and affect everybody else. So I hope you're getting what I'm accepting what I'm getting at here, which is this is no small endeavor. This is not something your Joe Schmo in his garage is going to pull off to be able to hack a data center, get at the code, and manipulate the code. So for those reasons, I'm going to rule out a data center breach as simply not being viable for a player of this game. Let's move on to the next one. So hacking the app or the game itself is the next thing that I'm going to attempt to rule out here. And I'm not going to say this is the most impossible or difficult thing to do in the world. You could potentially be running the game. You could put it into some type of environment where you could take a look at everything in memory in the phone. You could start manipulating things. You could manipulate them in such a way that the phone is the one that packages up the message and sends it back to the server and maybe get away with that. But as we pointed out, the reality with ranked play is that no matter what you do, you're not going to affect the game outcome because the game's already been handled on the server. So hacking the app is not going to do you any good for ranked play hacking. This is completely viable if you want to hack PvP or any of the other interactive ones. You can adjust your swings within the arcade mode, or you can intercept the message right before it gets sent back and alter it to put in that you got a home run in every single thing, and then send that back to the server. And the server might accept it if you do it well enough. Okay? But with ranked play, this is simply not viable. So this is the next one I'm ruling out. So at this point, this is where things get a little bit more interesting because then we start to enter into the realm of possibilities of stuff that people might be able to pull off in order to hack the game. And essentially what happens with a man-in-the-middle attack is you're sitting there and you're listening to all the network traffic, all the messages that are getting sent between your phone and the server. You can actually intercept, you can actually watch those. Not only can you intercept them, but you can record them. So you can record all the communication, and armed with this, with the recording of the communication, you can attempt to reverse engineer and determine what messages are being sent, the purpose of those messages, the construction of those messages, and therefore you could potentially construct messages yourself and send them to the server. So man in the middle means, oh, I'm listening to you give me this information from the server, and I'm either going to choose to pass it on or I'm going to manipulate it and pass it on to the phone, or vice versa. Or more likely in this case, oh, okay, well, I hear you, the phone, are trying to start a ranked play game. Let me manipulate that network message a little bit before we send it on to the server. Now, in some cases, people can do this manually. They can pause the whole thing. They can intercept the message. They can modify it, and then they can send it along its way. Or they might write an app to do that, which is also less likely in this case because, once again, I really doubt somebody could put that level of investment into this. But this does require in-depth knowledge and a full understanding of exactly how the packages are constructed. And here's a key thing. Messages between the server and your phone are generally protected in some way. In some cases, they've encrypted it, so that even if you intercept it, you don't know what's in the message. So how can you utilize something that's in the message if you can't even read it? Or in cases where it's not, and this has been known to happen, people have built APIs that's where they send in clear text what the operation is. In fact, my wife actually hacked a game this way. She would intercept things and manipulate them because they were sent via just normal HTTP messages. But anyways, I'm getting a little bit too in-depth there. You could potentially do this. You could grab this, but if it's encrypted, there's little you can do with it. And second, there's should be another protection Commons 2 should have in place, which is called a checksum, or something that validates the integrity of the message being passed. So that if you manipulate it, then COM2 can recognize this has been a tampered with message, and I'm not going to trust it. I'm going to either ignore it or I'm going to take some other preventative action. Okay, so this is a little bit more involved and less likely than our next variant, which is spoofing. Let's take a look at spoofing now. Spoofing is similar to man in the middle in as much as it occurs within the network traffic and you're watching the messages being passed back. But in the case of spoofing, you simply pretend to be the game client to the phone app and you send messages on the phone app's behalf. So you don't necessarily take existing messages and intercept them and modify them. You simply construct the messages yourself and you pretend and you send them on behalf of the phone and pretend to be the phone. Now, this is easy in a sense because, like I mentioned with Man in the Middle, you could potentially record network traffic, and instead of modifying it, if the game is developed or built poorly enough and is vulnerable enough, you could potentially record network traffic and simply play it back and send it back to the server and get results. And this, we'll take a look at this in just a second when I take a guess as to what's happening right now with the game. But anyways, this is the least barrier of entry. It's probably the easiest one to do. It also, however, assumes that you can get past any type of encryption on any type of messages if it exists, and or if you could get past any type of checksums or message protection. You can think of message protection like a wax seal on an envelope. If somebody's passing a message, they put a wax seal. They want to know that the message wasn't tampered with. The wax seal is broken. Obviously, the message has been tampered. It can't be. So a checksum, which would be commonly used, would be your wax seal, and the checksum wouldn't necessarily break, but the contents of the message would become compromised, and the checksum would recognize that, and the server would then know somebody's tampered with this and not to pay attention to it. So if COM2 has not implemented one of these two things, and there's a vulnerability right there, and that's, yes, somebody could potentially hack this. But once again, I'm assuming that COM2 is not stupid and that they have standard protections of their messages in place. Otherwise, I would have expected to see any types of hacks like these way earlier. So, lower barrier of entry, possible to do, theoretically should not be possible if good protections are in place. So, what is actually happening then? So going back to what I stated earlier in the beginning of the slideshow, there's been a thread on Reddit about this, and I have taken a very hard stance that is not nobody's hacking, that is virtually impossible, and that's why this video is being made. And yet, here we are, I'm making the video, and if you haven't had a chance to see, there's somebody sitting on top of the staged gameplay, there's somebody sitting very high or doing really well in ranked, the same team, and getting results that don't make sense. And so the question is, what really is happening? Because the proof, or not the proof, but the evidence is stacking up that something's going on. Somebody's pulling off something. And hopefully by this stage, with all the information I've given you, you can see why I took such a hard stance, that this is virtually impossible to do, and I really didn't believe it. But at this point, I'm having to get to the point where I'm having to admit that something's happening. I don't know what it is, but I do have a theory. It kept me up last night, and I came up with something that I think might be in play here. So let's take a look. My theory focuses in on the last thing that we covered, which is spoofing. My belief is that if there's a vulnerability, it probably lies here, and here's what I think has happened. I believe somebody's been recording the traffic and watching the traffic and noticing and paying attention and recognized when he tried to initiate a game and the outcome was very favorable, that he got a really good result from it. Okay? So what that means is that for that particular game that he initiated, it led to a favorable result. Well, what happens there? So walking through what we talked about earlier, it would need the game engine would need to generate a seed. And also referring to what we talked about earlier, commonly this is done for a timestamp. So my guess is the timestamp that's being used is in the message that is being passed from the phone to the server. What would result is if you're passing a timestamp consistently in requesting game results, you should get favorable outcomes from those game results by passing in the same timestamp every time. So if you were to spoof and replay and send a favorable message or a favorable initiation of a game that had a good timestamp in it, theoretically you would get good results out of this. Okay? So that potentially could lead to you being able to influence the outcome of games. But here's where my doubts start to seep in, because that actually doesn't make sense. If you were playing one team, the same team over and over again, yes, I could see similar results. But what we're seeing on Reddit is people reporting the same score against this one opponent. And with different lineups, if you put a different lineup and you feed it through the game formulas that figure out what the outcome of the game is, you're going to get a different result despite having a favorable seed, random number seed. So that part doesn't make sense. So this all depends on Com2 not having a good protection in place for recognizing a valid game request. Somebody saying, please generate a new game for me. I want to play a ranked game. Please generate it for me. If Com2 blindly takes the timestamp and uses that, that's a vulnerability. If they're not protecting their messages and encrypting them, somebody could be manipulating them and spoofing them. And then finally, if they don't have some type of checksum or wax seal on the messages, that's another possibility that somebody could be in there tampering with the messages. All these things make it very difficult. So I'm going to be very interested in seeing what Com2's reply is going to be. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, with the results that I'm seeing, I have no doubt that they're going to null and void this week's season, and we're going to get some type of compensation. Because, yeah, something's obviously going on. In other words, to an extent, I'm walking back what I said on Reddit, but I still maintain the position that it's virtually impossible to do this. So whatever somebody's done is certainly outside of what I can conceive of. They've come up with something very inventive, or are exploiting a weakness like I've just shown. So it'll be an interesting ride. Let's see what happens during this week, and I'm very curious to see what the outcome is going to be. And I hope you guys appreciated the content, or if this was at all informative to you. Feedback is always welcome. Thanks, guys. Good luck in ranked play, and bye for now.